Right, greetings, hello. Welcome to the Philosophy Club here in sleepy La Creuse, the centre of France. And it's a very historic part of France. Ancient Gaul was in the old days here. I'm watching a documentary about Vercingetorix, and he was from the neighbouring area, Auvergne, but very close to here. And that's where Caesar was trying to conquer the whole of Gaul. And, there's a lot of history in this part of France. The old Celts didn't really like Caesar coming and conquering them. Put up a fierce resistance, but eventually he won. And they all settled down living as Gallo-Romans for many centuries, which eventually morphed into the Christian tradition and became largely what we call modern France. The actual Franks who sort of gave their name to France, there weren't that many of them. They were just like an aristocratic elite who came in from around Belgium. The actual bloodstock of the ancient Gauls, the Gallo-Roman. So there's a bit of history you may not know. So it's interesting thinking about war and peace and what's going on in the world. And meditating on this, it was a very fearsome, bloody war that Caesar did against Gaul. And he massacred whole towns. Bourges, not far from here, was utterly massacred. Like, we're talking 40,000 inhabitants were slaughtered in cold blood. Because he was so strong-willed, he wanted to prove that he was the leader. Meanwhile, in another part of the forest, I'm reading Antony and Cleopatra with my daughter, Shakespeare's play. And if Antony had, Antony was part of that conquest in Gaul, and Caesar's lieutenant, so also a warlord. Still, the main thing I want to share, just by way of introducing our philosophy club today, is that I've been busy this week with the International Conference on Peace and Nonviolent Action, ICPNA, which I've been to many of these. They've been taking place in India. I've attended them in person on about 5 or 6 occasions, going to India for it. It's organised by the Jain community, which we've looked at in the periodic table. The Jains are the white boxes at the dead centre of the periodic table. And they are devoted to ahimsa, non-violence. And so they organised under Acharya Tulsi, their founder, as this movement called Anuviva, these series of conferences, which I first went to in 1995 in Rajasthan, a beautiful part of India, and met people that have stayed friends for life. Some of them were on our conference. This was done on Zoom because we didn't physically go to India this time. We all met in cyberspace and gave talks, and it was very moving actually to see some of these colleagues I've known for over 20 years speaking again about how we can bring non-violence, ahimsa, to the world and get us away from violence. Caesar, Vercingetorix, they were both pretty violent, although Vercingetorix was defending his homeland. What is it that makes human beings do this violence? And the war in Ukraine, Putin's invasion, is another example. Caesar attacking out of the blue. And it's interesting, the word Tsar comes from Caesar. The old warlords who ran Russia for centuries were called Tsars, meaning Caesars. And Putin very much is modelling himself on an old Tsarist kind of ideology, but without any kind of morality and any finesse. Tsarist Russia at least knew that Ukraine was a noble and distinct and profound culture in its own right. So, and the problems of Gaza and Israel's war on Palestine, Hamas's war on Israel, again, how can we bring non-violence to bear on this? So there were speeches from people all over the world. We heard from people from India and from Europe and from Americas. I couldn't begin to summarise them all. They're very profound talks by people who've spent years working on this. And there was one unit section on art and how art can be a vehicle for non-violence. My daughter Sophia contributed to that, along with other intellectuals, and Ignatius Xavier, who's a great artist from India, who's been doing ahimsa art. He focused on Burma and the conflict, the clampdown on Buddhist monks who were tortured and beaten up, and bombings in Colombo. You know, he's trying to use art to get across the ideal of non-violence. Other people talked about education and science. My friend Dr. Mishra, who's a very learned scientist in India, gave a brilliant talk about the role of science in helping advance non-violence, because the more we know about the complexity of life and how ecology works and how everything is interconnected, I think the less excuse there is for us humans to be killing each other. It's just a stupid waste of energy, resources, money in a broad sense. The amount of money being poured into the Ukraine-Russia war is just ridiculous. It's crippling the Russian economy, and it's really stretching the West as well. For what? More dead bodies piling up. It's a complete intellectual error of a great degree. We had experts in yoga talking about the forms of yoga and how they all tend towards non-violence. You can't study yoga unless you're committed to non-violence. And also truth. Sat is the goal of all spiritual striving, was stressed by many speakers. There were people from Poland and from all different walks of life and different faiths. So there were Jains, but also Christians and Hindus and many others. So anyway, thank you to everyone that took part. I'm in the middle of trying to write up a declaration based on this conference, which I'll circulate to colleagues. And I also wrote my own paper. I contributed. The theme was only non-violence can bring into being a sustainable and peaceful world. It made me think about what is sustainability. And I looked up the etymology. It's interesting. It's from Latin, sus, meaning under, and tenere, to hold to the under, what is underneath everything. So sustainability is the ability to find that which really underpins everything. The ecological wisdom at the heart of all being. Call it the realm of absolute reality, the dharmic sphere. Once we anchor our lives in that, it becomes a sustainable life. And so there were, many learned speakers talking about all this. It's fascinating. Although it did mean getting up at like 4 a.m. 3 mornings in a row, which is somewhat out of sync with my normal sleeping patterns. But it was quite fun for a change. And because that was 9 o'clock in India, so they're all up and early. Anyway, it was a great event, and in my paper, I did something, I think, new. I've not gone public with this before. I wanted to make a link between enlightenment, the nature of enlightenment, and, sustainability, ecology, and spirituality, because I did a kind of critique of the conventional view of enlightenment, which is, most people, if you ask what is enlightenment, they think, well, it's like you find the void and you end your life cycle here. You depart your body, you vanish into the void, you become a Buddha or an enlightened sage, and then you don't have to have a body again. You've escaped the wheel of suffering and life and death. That kind of model of enlightenment it's what I call the linear model, that you escape incarnation and you vanish off. Now that's quite common in different schools of enlightenment. My critique of that is that that's a bit anti-life, it's a bit anti-embodiment, it's anti-nature, as if it's a terrible thing to be an incarnation, to be born, so we should all escape as soon as possible. I think we need to rethink that view of enlightenment, and what I said in my paper is that we need a sustainable view of enlightenment, which is that there are enlightenments, plural, which we have at different phases of our life, and during different lives as well. If you believe, as I do, in reincarnation, that's a cyclical thing. So the shape of enlightenment is round, and ecological wisdom teaches us that we should honour all elements of nature, plants, animals, trees, the life cycle, each other, and have a cyclical respect for the ecological process as a whole. I should honour my fellow dharmas, dharmic beings, and therefore use non-violence towards them, and learn to appreciate the roundness of things. And that would require a kind of slight change in the way we think of enlightenment. Anyway, that was my paper, and I'm happy to share that with anyone that wants to read it. I can email it to you. Also, I coined, I think, a memorable phrase, because there's this concept in the peace movement, which I'm an active member. I run Philosophers for Peace, which I set up in Britain in the 1980s during the Greenham Common business in '84 with my colleague John Francis Phipps, and I'm president of Philosophers for Peace in Europe. So that's the sort of peace activist thing. And there's a phrase that peace activists like to say. They're calling for general and complete peace and non-violence and nuclear disarmament on the planet. The idea is to get ceasefires in all these wars and a complete disarmament, nuclear disarmament especially. I 100% support that. We need to move to a non-violent world. But I also argued in the paper that we're not going to reach that until we get general and complete and universal enlightenment. That has to be the metaphysical corollary that goes alongside getting rid of nuclear weapons. And I don't think we can do one without the other. If as a planet we can reach collective enlightenment, as Mahayana Buddhism teaches, and Taoism, and actually Christianity is supposed to be teaching, and other forms of spirituality, if we as a planet could reach collective enlightenment, then we would naturally get rid of nuclear weapons. It would just follow as night follows day. But until we're enlightened as a planet, there are always going to be sort of trolls, dark forces, military industrial espionage types that benefit from wars, benefit from weapons, make vast sums of profits from them. And so anyway, that was my challenge to the world community, really, is let's work on this idea of collective enlightenment, which has found it. I was inspired to that concept by my experience of Mahayana Buddhism when I was in my teenage years, which is the box up here, the Buddhist boxes. But I find collective enlightenment is also in Taoism. It's there in Chinese philosophical thought. It was there in Mo Tzu. It's there in Christianity, who says, "Thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven." Bring the enlightenment down to this realm is what Christ's work was all about. It's there in Hinduism when they talk about the Sat Yuga, that we can reach a place of truth. It's in our nature to be non-violent. We will reach Sat Yuga again. And it's there in Islam, which talks about the age of peace, that Christ and Muhammad will come back, usher in a peace world. And, Islam is supposed to be the avant-garde of that peace world, because Islam means peace, surrender. Surrender to the absolute, which then enables us all to live equally in mutual surrender to the divine will. And it's there also in Zoroastrianism, which teaches that one day Ahura Mazda will reclaim the planet for the forces of good and light. And in Judaism as well, their idea of the Messiah is really, which was borrowed from Zoroastrianism, the idea of the Seishad, is actually that the Messiah will come and usher in a time of universal peace and justice, not just for the tribe of Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel, but for all mankind. That is what's in Isaiah, that's what's in Hosea, and all the great prophets of Israel. It's not just enlightenment for Israel and everyone else can be, got rid of, which is kind of what... there is a streak in Israel's history of xenophobic, it's us against them type people, but that's not authentic Israel. And I think that universal enlightenment is also there in Judaism, which is why they've been such great teachers, scientists, academics, and why they have this striving towards universalism, which after all was what propelled Freud and Marx and other great intellectuals like Moses Hess to find universal truth, not just particular truth. So anyway, that's what I was arguing in my paper, that we need universal enlightenment. So I know it might seem a lot to ask, but honestly it's not. This is quite a small planet, and it's got seeds of enlightenment. We've been here a long time. There are great teachers on this planet who can bring that in and usher that in, and we should all work together and benefit from that. So anyway, and this is a guide or map which I used during my talk to say, look, here's a map on how we can do that. The talk was based partly on a course I taught a couple of years ago on enlightenments, plural, with Satyen Raja. And we went into each month, we did 12 monthly classes on enlightenment across all the traditions. So, we've done the work. Now we just have to get on and do the actual building. We've done the architecture. Now we've got to build the thing. So anyone that wants to help with the plan of complete global universal enlightenment and leading to complete nuclear disarmament and peace, please get in touch. That's what the Philosophy Club is for and what my Peace Studies Institute does. Right, okay, that's enough by way of introduction. It's been a busy week, actually. Let's move on and do our... let's choose a couple from the periodic table, I think. But can I ask as a thing this time, can we just choose the philosophy ones? Because we are a philosophy club, so choose from the bottom,
I have one.
the yellow ones.
I have one.
You have one from
Yes.
the philosophy? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, which one?
Thinking of you is philosophy, peace theory, and philosophy of law.
Okay, that's 166.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great, we'll come to that, yes. And Sophie, have you got one?
Cosmology,
What number's that?
160.
160. Okay, that's fascinating. Right. Excellent. Well, okay. So the point of the table is it's a table of all the world's different philosophical traditions and religious and theological traditions. So we're going to be focusing on the yellow ones, which is the more purely philosophical ones, although the religions obviously have a strong philosophical component. Peace theory and the philosophy of law, yes. Well, it's a huge topic, isn't it? I mean, mankind desperately needs peace, and yet it was neglected as a science in academia, per se, for many centuries. And it was only really in the period after World War II that academics and social scientists really began to look at peace as a thing and developed this field called peace research. It was partly in America with a man called Theodore Lentz who worked there. It was an important thinker called Johan Galtung in Norway, from Oslo, who was a social scientist. He helped set up a centre for peace research in Norway, which I visited. I've met Johan Galtung several times, and I have some rather sad news to announce that he died, I think yesterday. I just discovered this a few hours ago. He was the founder of peace studies in our time. I met him at conferences in Oslo, last in Istanbul at the International Peace Research Association. So he was like the leading intellectual on peace. He was a sociologist who thought in terms of social structure and conflict, and he invented this idea. Well, he believed that violence is also structural. It's not just about armies and battles. There's structural violence in a society with huge class differentiation. And I would say England, Britain, post-Brexit, has become utterly polarised between the very rich and the normal poor. It's forced apart. So that's what Galton called structural violence. Brexit has ushered in vast structural violence in the UK, which is why I'm utterly opposed to Brexit, because I knew it was a dream of the plutocrats and the arms dealers and the people that benefit from conflict and violence. And Galton was a bit of a saint. He was a conscientious objector. He refused to be in the Norwegian army. I think he served time in prison, because in those days you had to. And I've read some of his autobiographical writings. He was very influenced by ecological thought, Arne Næss, another Norwegian intellectual. He was influenced by Gandhi. He discovered Gandhian thought when he was young. although he was born into a Christian context, Lutheran, he didn't find Christianity as it was presented in churches to be particularly convincing. He wanted truth, and he felt churches were presenting a sort of package deal based on faith, which seemed to him to not require much intellect. It was just like you bought the package and sang the hymns. Whereas Galton was an intellectual. He was quite critical of trends and movements. He was attracted to Buddhism. He spent some time in Japan studying Oriental religions. He found that we in the West are too much focused on becoming the chosen people. He felt that this idea, which was both Jewish and Christian, to some extent Islamic, that a people should be a chosen people, was part of the problem. In his more perennialist approach, we're all chosen people, every tribe, and we have to find a way to live together. No one person is the chosen people. And I must say, as he was dying, he must have known about the Gaza war. It must have absolutely tormented him to think he's leaving a world where that nonsense can still be going on. So I'm sorry, Galton. We're doing our best to get peace on this planet, but it is proving difficult. And you were right. This myth of being the chosen ones is partly responsible. So we need to re-examine that whole myth, that concept. What is it to be chosen? I think a mother chooses to love all her children equally. And if we look at things from a philosophical perspective, then every living being, every living person is sacred to the cosmic mother. That's where Galton was coming from. And he inspired my setting up the International Institute of Peace Studies and Global Philosophy, which I direct. When I worked at the University of London, he gave lectures for us, and I met him at conferences. But he's just one of several hundred academics and intellectuals who've been developing peace research over the last 50 years, 70 years now. Another was Cedric Smith, who was a personal colleague of mine, ran the Conflict Research Society in London, which was set up back in the 60s. I was their information officer for a while. My colleague, Dr. Hugh Mile, has been running it for a while. And it's the leading thing in Britain that does peace and conflict research. And, there's a lot of work to be done, and it requires an interdisciplinary approach. So peace theory is drawing on sociology, also economics. Why is class conflict and economic disparity part of conflict and war? It draws on anthropology, studies of how there is a sort of innate violent streak in hominids, chimpanzees and so on, and as our evolutionary line evolved, so some of our ancestors have been pretty violent. Where does that come from, and can we grow out of it, please? There's evidence that certain tribes of Neanderthals were cannibalistic, which is a sort of supreme form of violence. Well, how can we grow out of all those kind of trends? And I think I've said this before, but when China attacked Tibet, when the Maoist armies invaded, they used political cannibalism to frighten and scare the Tibetans into complete submission, which is, utterly shocking. And yet that's what human beings do. We're capable of that. So anthropologists need to study how we can become more peaceful and non-violent. Historians who can look at the broad sweep of social change over long cycles of history, like Toynbee and others, that's called macro history, and that's something Galton did. That's part of it. And then philosophers like me who want to look at, the ultimate meaning, the metaphysics of existence, and say, is this planet supposed to be just full of violence and bombs going off? Is that the way it's got to be, or is it actually striving to more peaceful and loving orientation, as I believe? So there's a philosophical component, and then a religious and theological thing. What is the ultimate truth behind existence? And does that want us to kill each other and ourselves and blow up the planet? Or are we meant to be cooperating and having a sustainable, peace-oriented life here? That's my faith. So there's a lot of very interesting thinkers and colleagues around the world that are doing this. Lester Kurtz teaches at George Mason University, which does degrees in peace studies, conflict research, founded by some important thinkers. There's a lineage of intellectuals doing peace research around the planet. And in Africa, African universities, and there's a colleague in China teaching at Nanjing University, peace research. But yeah, we need more resources so that more thinkers can really come at this from a holistic perspective. And in political science, we need people to apply nonviolence thinking into politics as a real thing. Gandhi did, but he wasn't really a theorist, he was an activist. Martin Luther King was a theorist, he was a great theologian, but he was too busy leading his campaigns for civil rights, and then he was shot. He did do a doctorate in Boston University in comparative spirituality and religion and peace, influenced by Gandhi. And there have been other great thinkers who have inspired. There's a chap called Glenn Page who worked in Hawaii. He said we should talk about non-killing societies instead of non-violent. Let's be specific. What we're opposed to is human beings killing other human beings, willfully and wantonly, and just So non-killing societies was Glenn Page's idea, which is that there were people speaking at the conference taking that forward. And if you go further back in time in the history of philosophy, which is obviously one of my passions, different thinkers in the past have called for peace. Kant, great philosopher, called for universal peace. Jeremy Bentham did. The Stoics did. Pythagoras did. The greatest thinkers of all history have always called for peace. So I think it's time to deliver. I think mankind, we've got to get our act together. And the great prophets of the Islamic, Christian, Jewish tradition have called the same. They're all going on about peace. Jerusalem is supposed to mean the foundation of peace. I still hold out that it will become that in our lifetime. And we will have a proper peace treaty between all the nations, and that violence will go. Why is that in the same box as the philosophy of law, one might ask? I'm a great lover of law. I've gone to courses and conferences, and I have friends who are lawyers. I could have been a lawyer, but I chose not to be because I think, much as I love law, I think the question of justice is a philosophical one. Law is what happens when people fall out and conflict develops, and then you have to go to court. It's much better to prevent that stage, if you can, through mediation and through dialectic, as Socrates would say. So the philosophy of law is the question of what is justice, what is law, what's the difference? And we're seeing this like with the trial of Trump, and this is a guy who games the system, tries to get away with murder, and I doubt that he's actually, I don't mean literally, I mean in his approach and relations with other people. He hides behind legal practice so that he can then reign triumphant. And the same with Putin in Russia. He uses law, misuses it, to do evil. And his most recent thing is arresting Navalny, the great critique of Putin, and then having him killed off, assassinated using slow poison. We don't know exactly how. He won't release the body for establishing that. The family are demanding the body and will take it to a post-mortem. Putin's not going to allow that because it will show up his guilt. And this is something he's done before with other people. And he terrorizes Russia into accepting this stuff as if it's normal. He's not the only dictator on the planet that's misusing the legal system in that way. The way the justice system has persecuted Assange, an Australian journalist who tried to expose what was going on in Iraq, and he's been incarcerated for 3 years. Australia's now called on America to end their extradition and to let him go back to Australia. I think Assange should be allowed to go home to Australia, and the charges should be dropped. He was just doing his journalistic duty. So we're seeing everywhere in the world, justice is being flouted and it can be bought. I've witnessed stuff in courts in England where lawyers are very cynical and don't really want justice, they just want to make a living and they don't care about the verdict, whether it's true or not. I think lawyers should have to swear an oath of telling the truth in court. They shouldn't be allowed to lie on behalf of their clients. Caesar is another example in the Roman legal system. He was about to be questioned for war crimes in Gaul, and the Senate had recalled him to Rome to face judgment. And what Caesar did was he marched his army on Rome, and he arrested the senators and he took over the control of the government. That's what a dictator is. They're someone that can't face justice, which is why Cicero stood up to him. And Cicero was one of the great thinkers. He was a lawyer, but he believed in actual justice and ethical law. So anyway, if we're going to get peace on this planet, it will partly come through law being properly applied. For instance, in the International Court of Justice, in its declaration of warning Israel that it seems to be in jeopardy of committing genocide against the Palestinians and that they must take these measures. As far as I can tell, Israel hasn't really listened. Netanyahu lives in a bubble of self-justification, which is like, I can do as much evil as I want because I'm from the people that are chosen by history to be the good ones, and therefore I can slaughter the other guys as much as I want. This is exposed in a book called How Many People Did God Kill in the Bible by Steve Wright, I believe his name is. And it's a masterpiece, and all it is a survey of the Bible, and each page of the Bible, he counts up how many people God is responsible for killing, smiting. And it's something like 2.5 million actual deaths caused by God. The Bible discovers, I think Satan is responsible for 2 murders in the Bible, 2 deaths, there's a sort of irony here, isn't there? But there's a reading of the Bible that seems to justify slaughtering in the name of God. And this, I think, is what, we need to be more sophisticated in our intellectual work and realise that those were very ancient Bronze Age kind of people who believed in violence as a justification. We don't have to be wedded to those explanations anymore. So the philosophy of law and how we think about what is justice and what is truth is going to usher in peace or not. If we continue down this path of legalism and justifying violence and disregarding the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, it's going to end in tears. I mean, it's already ended in tears for tens of thousands of innocent Palestinian women and children and men who've been slaughtered. Whole families have been wiped out. This is a genocide we're witnessing. And of course the attack by Hamas was terrible too. So I would say that we should be dealing with this through law. There should be a legal commission of inquiry. I believe the victims of the Hamas terror attack are taking the matter to the International Court of Justice in The Hague, which is, they might have to go to the International Criminal Court because the International Court of Justice deals with wars between nations and Hamas isn't a nation. But, it should be done legally and it should have been done from day one through international courts. That's what Kant called for, the philosopher, that we should have a legal court system for peacemaking. Right, so that's that one. Difficult but very dear to my heart, so I've explained that in some depth. The other one that is here